Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on the somewhat controversial and indeed delicate topic of the party politics of the City of London. We're no doubt in an era of political upheaval across the globe, so it's an apt time to ponder the key political challenges facing the city, as it still recovers from the reputational hangover of the 2008 financial crisis, with its enduring affinity with the Conservatives facing uncertainty, and all in the setting of a volatile economy and geopolitical instability. This morning, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Joe Ganderson, a postdoctoral researcher at the European Institute London School of Economics, where he teaches and researches the party politics of financial and banking regulation in Europe. His work has been published in several academic journals, and he regularly presents his findings to academic conferences and at the Bank of England, so we're very fortunate to be hearing his insights today. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I'm Charlotte Dorbrashley, and I manage the FS Club here at CN. And I'm sitting in the heart of the city today with Mansion House and the Bank of England on my doorstep. I must offer sincere thanks to our very generous sponsors who enable us to continue to bring you a wide range of thought-provoking content across finance, technology, and economics. Some housekeeping points before we get on to the juicy stuff. The slides are available for you to download now in the chat box and on our website, and we'll be holding a 20-minute Q&A session after Joe's presentation, so please use the GoToWebinar chat facility to send your questions in to me, and then I'll feed them into the conversation. Right, that's all from me. I'll now turn to Joe to fascinate us with his insights.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thanks for the introduction. I'd also, there we go. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Thanks for that. I'd like to thank Etienne for the opportunity to speak this morning, Michael Minelli, Peter Welch, Sasha Davis for your support, and Charlotte for the introduction. And thank you to everyone in the audience for turning up. So I'm going to talk about the delicate party politics of the City of London today, a slight retrospective of where we've been and a little bit of a discussion about where we might be going. And I hope to use this opportunity to learn from some of you in the audience, some practitioners, your thoughts on some of these questions that I raise as I go quite briskly through some talking points. But I'd just like to start, if I may, with a quick flash poll of the audience. I'm not going to ask anybody in the audience which party they support, but I'd like to ask if it's clear to you which political party represents UK financial services interests best overall. And if you're not in the UK and you don't have that much knowledge of the UK's political system, then by all means answer for your own country. It's not a scientific exercise, but if we could take a few seconds to do that, I'd be intrigued to know what everybody thinks.
Thanks, Joe. We'll just give them a minute or so to answer. Our audience is usually pretty quick off the mark here. Okay, nearly there. Just a few more to go. Right. Okay, so we've got the results in now.
Okay, interesting split. And you know, perhaps the discussion points today will change your thinking. Perhaps they'll provoke further thoughts and discussions. No clear majority here. It's a bit of a divide in the audience. So I'm intrigued to hopefully hear some views later as we go through this. Let me get to my next slide. Okay, so this is a bit of a running order of what we'll talk about today. I want to give the audience a bit of a primer on how those of us who work in political science, those academics that are interested in the City of London, think and tend to conceive of it. Then I'll compare and contrast the traditions of the Conservatives and Labour in recent decades, hopefully to provide a little bit of insight into how they fundamentally approach the city and think about it. Then I want to talk a little bit about why I see the politics of the City of London at the moment is particularly delicate, and for these two parties as they approach governance. I'll refer specifically to Rishi Sunak's 4 stated priorities for financial services from his white paper from July last year, a new chapter on financial services, and then just a few concluding remarks. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your points in the Q&A afterwards. And if anything's not clear, as I said, I move a bit briskly, then hopefully we can clarify anything afterwards. And I'd love to hear from any members of the audience too. We can correspond after the conversation if you'd like. So those of us who study the city, how do we think about it? Well, we tend to think of policymaking processes such as, regulation, finance as a sort of two-way signalling process that parties and firms in the city or the associations that represent them are keen to actually share information with each other to signal their intent to one another. So from policymakers, the intent of their regulatory initiatives, whether it's re-regulation, deregulation, imposing more stringent rules, typically from the city side of things, from the business side of things, information about costs and benefits of proceeding. So parties and firms, and especially in finance, like to interact. And there's a sort of poverty on the party and political party side of understanding about how complex financial services actually work. So they tend to seek out this kind of information. And in this context, I think, and the consensus seems to be that UK finance possesses some real unique strengths that place it in a good position as far as the signalling process goes. And obviously, you're probably well aware of its economic weight. It's sort of oversized or disproportionate economic weight in the UK economy relative to other advanced economies. 2.3 million jobs if you have a broad accounting of finance and insurance and real estate. 195 billion pound gross value added, which is about 10% of gross value added to the UK's GDP. 78 billion pound trade surplus, which is the biggest in the world. So it has a lot of economic heft behind it. It also it's pretty well connected politically. It's well connected to sort of deeply institutionalized networks of governance in the UK, the Bank of England, the Treasury, within Westminster. There are significant donations coming from city individuals and firms to parties, so disproportionately to the Conservative Party, which I'll discuss shortly. And it has very well-resourced and knowledgeable associations working sort of as an umbrella on its behalf. So the City UK is the main peak association for UK finance now, providing expertise and guidance on policy making. It also has typically weak NGO opposition. So in some sectors, oil and gas, natural resources, utilities, there is more public prevailing opposition to what business interests want to do, large business interests in particular. There are some emergent groups in the UK like Positive Money and the Tax Justice Network that have tried to challenge and push for more radical reforms of the city since the crisis, but they haven't managed to make strong inroads. And the city has pretty weak opposition, and it tends to have pretty strong bonds within it. Though I want to discuss and want to learn a little bit from the audience about if that might be changing. So typically, firms within the city have read off the same hymn sheet, wanted the same things. And intersectorally, the city has been influential in moving broader business communities thinking about government policy. So, the CBI and others will take their cues from what the city is saying about government policy and how that will affect the real economy. But I want to posit that the city also has some particular and acute weaknesses in the context of how it can signal its intent and get what it wants, and financial firms can achieve a favourable climate for themselves. It has an enduringly poor reputation. And so YouGov, the pollsters, did some polling in 2018, a retrospective a decade after the crisis, and found that of 26 sectors, banking and insurance were down, had a 73% net bad favorability rating, which placed them at the bottom of all the sectors they studied, down with gambling and utilities and other generally quite unpopular sectors. So the city has a sort of reputational problem that is lingering on from the crisis. And if you want to look at this quadrant here, you can see that basically there's a difference between the economic weight that I discussed and that is appreciated by politicians in the UK and how the public perceive it. You'll see that collectively in this YouGov poll, you had 73% of the population perceiving the sector not to be important to the economic success of the UK, which is at odds with the sort of statistics that I mentioned before. And a plurality, 38%, actually seeing the city holding or finance holding the UK economy back, which is a problem reputationally for the sector. Generally, it's not very good at engaging in public fights and public battles as well. It has an inexperienced PR machine. Now, a clear counterexample to this is an interesting case study was the HSBC campaign from 2018, when HSBC sort of boldly decided to wade adjacently into politics with this We Are Not an Island campaign, pushing in the middle of the white heat of Brexit polarisation in 2018 and sort of public polarisation, political polarisation in Westminster, pushing a kind of cosmopolitanist pro-global outlook that got a lot of conversation going and actually had quite good results for HSBC commercially. But it was an exception rather than the rule in terms of how financial firms directly engage the public politically. And something I'd perhaps like to learn a little bit more about is whether there are emergent sectoral divisions within finance. So between perhaps first generation firms like established retail banks and newer firms like hedge funds and alternative investments that might want mutually exclusive regulatory regimes and approaches. And this has been brought to the surface by Brexit. So if I can just talk a little bit about how I see the two parties' traditions. Labour's tradition was historically sectorally split. There was an antagonism between the party and finance. As late as 1989, Neil Kinnock said, the Conservatives are the party for the city and we are the party of manufacturing. But since 1990, there's been an acceptance across all the party leaders since then that the party needs to work with finance and accommodate it rather than against it. The party typically, as far as my research tells me, sees itself as a little bit constrained by finance. It respects the economic weight that I mentioned in the previous slide, and it wants to work with finance, but it can't overreach in terms of its regulatory and tax regimes because it's scared of essentially scaring off investment from the sector. It also has pretty weak political ties, so not many Labour politicians have come from the city, and it doesn't receive much money from city individuals. And its basic approach then has been one of making discrete charm offensives. Each new Labour leadership, each new leadership team goes anew to the city with a message about its credibility, about how it doesn't threaten the city and how the two entities, Labour and the city, can work together. Now, this was strongest under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Since the crisis, there has been a little bit more antagonism again, but actually even under the stewardship of Jeremy Corbyn, there were advances. John McDonnell spent quite a lot of time in the city trying to at least quell and assuage concerns of the city about a potential Labour government. So the fact that John McDonnell would deign to go to the city gives you an indication that the party is a hard test of the party's commitment to trying to sell itself to the city and to the sector. Now, on the Conservative side, it's naturally assumed by a lot of people that the Conservatives would have a free market affinity with the goals of the City of London of finance, and that's generally true. But since the crisis, I want to say that there's been a little bit more volatility in that relationship. Two critical junctures, really, where the Conservatives might have taken a more abrasive approach than Labour. Initially on post-crisis banking re-regulation, where Labour actually took a more hawkish, the Conservatives took a more hawkish stance in some ways, and also notably on Brexit, which the majority of the city was opposed to, and then angled for a softer landing on, which Labour agreed with the majority of city firms on that, but Conservatives, pursued their course nevertheless. I would suggest that the city sees, if Conservatives see the city in more balanced terms, they're prepared to defy it actually at times, but generally prepared to accommodate it. But they don't see themselves as constrained by its economic weight as the Labour Party. And partly this is, I think, a self-confidence that comes from the strong political ties between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, Conservatives and the city. So in 2010, at the sort of peak of the crisis, or the election after the crisis, several influential Conservatives, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Sajid Javid, Andrea Leadsom, Stephen Barclay, Kwasi Kwarteng, so future ministers, all came from the city into Westminster. Only one Labour MP in that new intake came from the city, and that was the current Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. So there's a disproportionate sort of revolving door between the city and Westminster that favours the Conservatives, and that's before you get to the donations that come from the city to the party, which are very, very strongly disproportionately to the Conservatives. So what I would say about the basic approach of the Conservative Party is that there's an assumed support that it gives to the city. And of course, we have Rishi Sunak, a particularly friendly, city-friendly chancellor at the moment with his background. He arrived in 2015 in Westminster, former hedge fund partner and investment banker. But there is a sort of peculiarly revolutionary tendency in the Conservative Party sometimes to defy majority finances or landed financial interests. We saw this actually with the Big Bang, what Philip Auger has called the death of gentlemanly capitalism, the revolution in the city in the 80s. We're seeing it sort of playing out now over Brexit. So I want to just talk about a few dimensions that this might play out in based on Rishi Sunak's priorities. What we have is a general climate then where actually both parties are broadly supportive, and particularly under the current Labour leadership of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, they've been making very pro-city and pro-business overtures, but they're constrained by a wider political climate that is hostile potentially to the prevailing interests of the city. Now let's take the four priorities sketched out by Rishi Sunak. And the first one is his quote, an open and global financial hub, so to make the city an open and global financial hub. This is essentially coded language for the Brexit divergence question. Now there's a lot of pressure on Sunak from sort of ultra-liberal sections of the city and within his own party to go from max divergence from the EU to shared equivalence actually quickly, and to not kind of handcuff yourself to the European Union. Labour has actually positioned itself, though it's keeping its powder dry in policy terms, as more of a reconciliatory equivalence pursuing party. So this is a dividing line between the two of them. Sunak has talked up integrating financial services deals and relationships with China and the USA. And I would suggest that the current geopolitical climate makes that particularly difficult, and he might be forced to choose a course between one or the other. And even on an individual basis, both of these two countries present certain challenges for financial services integration. Technology and innovation. In European terms, London and the UK is already a leading player for fintech. Rishi Sunak wants to push this further. I would suggest that the issue here might be principal agent tensions between the government and the regulators. The FCA already has a quite peculiar brief in that it's briefed to actually be sort of embrace competitiveness. But as we know from the volatility of the government's potential embrace of cryptocurrency, the development of central bank cryptocurrency at the Bank of England, there's a delicate balance to be struck here between pushing competitiveness onto regulators and allowing them to do their job of securing the system. So this is something that will, continue as we go forward. And the third dimension is making the city the green capital of the world, to green finance. We've seen an issuance of government green gilts, but there's an open question about how much pressure Rishi Sunak and the government want to put on city firms to decarbonize and divest from carbon investments. And in the meantime, certain sectors of the EU, certain countries and the EU in general seem to be moving ahead in areas like green disclosures, sustainability of stock markets, environmental, social and governance considerations, and on green bonds. And the danger, I think, here for the government is pleasing nobody, is that they'll encounter increased pressure from environmental lobbies and from those saying that they're not going far enough, but they might also alienate some firms by pushing them too far too fast. So this is another sort of delicate area. And finally, there's an area of there's a priority of just making the UK competitive, making the City of London competitive. And I think there are a few elephants in the room here. It's more about what's not on Rishi Sunak's agenda than what's on it. We saw that he was brave and bold enough in this political climate to reduce the bank surcharge and corporation tax from 8% to 3%. So that's the extra corporation tax that banks were paying on top of the base rate, as opposed to other firms. But he hasn't, for example, moved on the generally disliked EU bonus cap, which he's maintained and is refusing to budge on, and is generally a little bit unpopular in the city. So in this political climate where we're going to have a cost of living crisis and perceptions of inequality are tied quite closely to the sector and to finance, and it doesn't have a great story to tell of itself that really kind of conveys its value added, it's quite difficult for politicians to move in this area on these fundamentals of tax and regulation that the city might be looking for, certainly when it comes to attracting talent. So these are a few areas for discussion. I've skirted through them quite quickly, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who are more knowledgeable than me about each of them. I'd like to hear from people about them. I would say that the pressure on the two parties vary a little bit by the different policy areas. Labour might feel more pressure to move further on greening finance, the Conservatives on technology and innovation and competitiveness, but I would suggest that it's not substantial. They're both constrained by the political climate of forming an electorally popular platform that is sellable to the public in this current climate. And touching finance is a problem, at least doing so publicly is a problem for both parties. So just a few concluding remarks then. We're in a climate now where both major parties actually are quite friendly and want to be friendly towards the city, but they're facing pressures from perhaps their own voter bases, perhaps the broader political climate that we're living in, and constraints that are stopping them potentially from doing so. I would say that the Conservatives are quite an expedient party when they deal with the city, and the city can't really rely on that allegiance that you would suspect to always be there holding at all times. Rishi Sunak is doing a lot of lifting himself. He's a reassuring presence in the city, but he might not be there forever. He's had a bad week, of course, and he might not be there forever. And the party, as I said, has a sort of revolutionary streak where it can tear things up and ask finance to reinvent itself, and this might accentuate some of the divisions between firms that I identified earlier, between first and second generation city firms. The city has to do something, I think, about its public image problems. They're dormant at the moment. You know, it's not that it's sort of loathed and hated or distrusted on a daily basis, but they are persistent. And what the YouGov data told us was that when people were actually informed about the economic weights of the city and what it does for the economy, they tapered down their dislike or their distrust of the city. And equally, you know, they have a perception of it skewing economic gains for London. They have very positive, people have very positive images of their local branch, but they have quite negative images of the sector, of financing finance, and not really delivering enough to the real economy as far as people might be concerned. And the problem is, if there's another crisis or a scandal, this really reduces the city's leverage to actually defend itself politically. And as I mentioned on the last slide, I think the government's 4 stated priorities, which I wanted to bring up as talking points, hopefully we can address some of them in the Q&A. Each of them have specific dangers that will remain going forward. So thank you very much for listening. The argument I've written here, a historical review of the way the parties are, is coming out in a forthcoming article in the Political Quarterly Journal in the next couple of months, hopefully. So if any of you are interested in reading more, then please take a look at that. But I'm looking forward to hearing from you, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Joe. Great timing there. That was certainly thought-provoking. So please do keep sending your questions and using the chat facility. I'd like to use the chair's prerogative to kick things off. Joe, I'm interested on your thoughts in the comparison between the city and Westminster here in the UK with Wall Street and Washington in the US.
Yeah, so Wall Street, I think, is a more polarizing and I said in the last slide that the reputation problems that finance has in the UK are dormant, and they're often activated by scandals or crises. Whereas I think it's more of a live issue in American politics. And for example, the American left, or the Democratic Party more specifically, which is a broad church, is quite divided on this. But you have Bernie Sanders, for example, Bernie Sanders has a sort of consistently critical narrative about the Wall Street and Wall Street versus Main Street, essentially finance versus the real economy, and them being in conflict with each other. Whereas I think in the UK, I think certainly since the 90s, the Labour Party has seen the city as something to be worked with, to be listened to be accommodated. As I said, the fact that John McDonnell went to the city, and the reviews of how well he was received are mixed. Some city executives seemed to receive him quite well, others didn't particularly receive him well. But the fact that he went to finance and tried to persuade the city that a Labour government wasn't necessarily a threat, and that he had an open door to listen to concerns, sort of illustrates the fact that Labour feels more constrained at all times, no matter who's leading it, in terms of how it deals with the city, and shows more respect to it, I think, than the American left typically sees of Wall Street. But it should also be said, just briefly, that Wall Street in America has also learned to defend itself. You have more high-profile executives like Jamie Dimon, for example, at JP Morgan, who is quite prepared to go on television and say provocative things and make a stout defense of finance, of Wall Street, of his particular firm. We don't see that in the UK. So there are some cultural differences between the imagination of Wall Street and the City of London.
Thank you. Right, Andrew Tong has asked if you could comment on the long discussed question of the city's low residential population threatening its position as a local authority.
Yeah, so as far as I remember, as far as I know, the city has something like 10,000 residents and 300,000 workers. It's extremely skewed by this. But I must admit, Andrew, and I apologise, I'm not entirely up on this controversy and whether it will be, and whether it is how the extent to which it's under threat, and whether that might be taken away from it and what that actually means. But I do know, for example, that the sort of peculiar ecosystem around the City of London Corporation, for example, there's a lot of advocacy work for it. And I would presume that if that was to be taken away from it, that would have detrimental effects on its capacity to influence politics. But yes, I'm not entirely sure exactly about where we are with that and how close that is to being realised. But if you want to get in touch, we can always talk afterwards about that one.
Thank you. Clive Bullen has asked, how's Keir Starmer considered? So he's a lawyer who is head of the CPS, so he's got an impressive CV. So how does that translate to how he's thought of the city?
So Keir Starmer has, of all the Labour leaders since Tony Blair, come closest recently to reappropriating the language of Labour being the party of business. Now, whether business believes that is another question, and I don't think that the city and business more generally is quite ready to jump over yet. But there are some signs that the climate might be favourable, not least because the Conservative Party are potentially scoring own goals. So, there's a famous four-letter word used by Boris Johnson to describe how he felt about business in the climate of Brexit, and a general sense that he doesn't take their concerns too seriously, or potentially that they can be taken for granted. Keir Starmer is positioning himself as a competent, steady hand who's not going to tear things up. But I think that and shifting out Annalise Dodds and appointing Rachel Reeves, so one of the few Labour MPs with a background in the city, is also a signal of him, taking their concerns seriously and an overture towards them. But I think there's still some work to be done in policy terms. I think Labour are keeping their powder dry, as I said in the presentation, because they don't want to be outmaneuvered in policy terms by the Conservatives before an election that's likely to come in 2024. So EU equivalence is something they've hinted at. But beyond that, we don't really know where they stand. Their current broad message is they're labelling the Conservative Party as a high tax, low growth party. That's their economic message, which sounds peculiar because it sounds like a message that the Conservative Party would level at the Labour Party. But it's actually the Labour Party calling the Conservative Party a high tax, low growth party. This hints that the Labour Party isn't planning, for example, on tax hikes as part of its policy programme, but we'll have to wait and see.
Right, on a related note, Bob McDowell asks if you think the distinct growth of people choosing a political career early in life is an increasing challenge to its relationship with the city.
Yes, that's a really interesting point. So the pipeline into politics is often criticised as not giving people enough real-world experience, as it were. And if you go through being a junior parliamentary researcher or working for the party, and then you might have a failed attempt at a seat, but you show your loyalty to the party, and then you get parachuted into a safer seat, and you go into Westminster. And this is actually a trajectory that's being followed by quite a few people. Potentially, it could be a problem, but I think that the supply line, as it were, of people coming from the city into politics might be a bigger problem, in the sense that you know, it's a bit of a sacrifice for people to go into politics now, given the comparative levels of pay you can get at the top of your career, the amount of public scrutiny you have to face. So I think we do need a rethink about the kind of climate we live in and how you can get talent from different sectors, not just from the city, into politics. But I think it could be a problem if we have people that don't have applied knowledge of the sector that they're trying to regulate, for example, doing that, sort of sermonizing about that. So I would agree with, I think, a little bit with the premise of the question. I think it's generally healthy for people to come into politics after having a career in something else.
Right, apologies if I pronounce this wrong, but Marlos Nichols has asked, a flagship proposal in the upcoming Financial Services Bill is to reintroduce objectives for regulators to promote the international competitiveness of the finance sector, a policy that HMT and Parliament previously found to have contributed to the global financial crisis. So can you say a bit more about the delicate politics of that proposal?
Yeah, I mean, so this is where, when I talked about the principal agent problem faced with technology, for example, I think that's a broader question. So Rishi Sunak's vision is one, he's broadly being pressured to liberalize and to pull back regulations. And that is a prerogative that it will probably need to do if we want to, for example, get select financial services trade agreements with the US or US states. That they'll want reciprocal access. And the extent to which this affects regulators and undermines regulators is a potential problem, because, you know, historically the role of a regulator has not been to facilitate competitiveness, but to act as a kind of shield that stops things going wrong. And we could have a potential problem with that. I think the next time that there's a bubble, a crash, a crisis, or a scandal related to the city. Now, there hasn't been one since, not a big one since 2008, and there were, you know, aftershocks of that crisis, LIBOR in 2013, for example, and several firm-specific scandals. But I think there are potential problems there, and I think that this is where a controversy could arise in the future. Yeah.
Henry Tillman said a recent city research paper clearly warned the city's lagging behind competitors in digitalisation. However, the City Forum on 7th of April, only the great and the good, doesn't even address this problem, and the major firms are noticing this, which can harm the brand. Do you have any comments on that?
Wow, I mean, that is not an area of expertise of mine, but I'm very intrigued about it. So essentially, it's, I think, a question of infrastructure that allows that, you know, firms to compete. So one thing I knew about historically, for example, that gave London a comparative advantage was it had, for example, fiber optic infrastructure that allowed it to execute trades milliseconds faster than other cities around the world. It was very well infrastructurally linked. But as far as digitization goes, I actually don't know. I didn't know that actually. So thank you for that question. I wasn't sure that was a controversy, and it's always good to learn a little bit from what firms are concerned about. So I didn't know that this was a concern for them, but I'm intrigued to learn it. So thanks for raising it.
Tim Skeet has got straight to the point and said, what should the city do about its abysmal reputation?
So the HSBC campaign was an interesting one, but it didn't. So what it did was it carried a political message without actually defending or directly defending the firm itself or promoting the firm. It had an upshot of, you know, some people didn't like the message, but others really liked it, and it actually sort of paid for itself quite handsomely. It paid off for HSBC. What should it do? Well, I think, you know, the city delivers a lot of benefits for a start outside of London. A lot of these jobs, a lot of this money is outside of London, but there's a broad perception that this is not, the benefits of this sector are not evenly shared or not shared well enough. And I think that it could, I think that it needs to get a little bit better at public information campaigns are promoting its sort of regional reach. It's how it actually funds the real economy and local economies. Now, how it embarks on this PR campaign, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that it's prudent for the city to invest in its reputation in the quiet times, in the good times, especially for when things go wrong in the bad times, because that's when it needs some reputational credit in the bank. And I think, one part of the government's agenda is levelling up the regions. I think if the city can connect itself to policy agendas like this and talk about what role it has to play and how it actually creates value and wealth in the economy outside of London, this can help. If it can somehow connect head offices of firms to the local branch person that you deal with when you go into the branch and you have a good relationship with, your mortgage advisor, your clerk, or so on, that generally are very well seen. So it might be subtle things like the way it communicates to its customers in branch or via its personal communications and correspondence about what the firm's doing and what it's doing for the UK economy. But I think this would be a start. It's a little bit of a long road back, but that would be a start.
Okay. Professor Bob Garrett has said his experience is that the financial city is morphing away from pure finance and becoming a global super hub, embracing two distinct groupings. First, next generation investors, few of whom are actually interested in the stock exchange, and shareholders, more project-based infrastructural social investment. And then secondly, the growth of the 55 plus year olds who are sort of redundant in the finance sector but full of business experience needed in many other countries. So he's asking, do your studies reflect this?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I raised in the presentation potentially a difference between, say, first and second generation financialized firms. So on the one side, you have a bunch of banks, insurers, consultancies broadly wanted, for example, as much free trade to continue as possible with the EU after Brexit, versus, say, alternative investments and hedge funds that were pushing actually for a sort of more liberalized view of the future. I hadn't actually thought about it in the way that the professor mentioned, in terms of the sort of generational split, for example, in the city. And what they're trying to do. I'm not an expert about that, but that could also be an area of potential difference. One thing I wanted to take from the audience was the sense of the city tends to do better when it, as I said, reads off the same hymn sheet. If it's increasingly dividing itself into different camps that want mutually exclusive things, it might struggle to deliver. So I'm intrigued about that and the implications of that, and whether the professor thinks that will lead to firms potentially relocating, or broader changes in the complexion and composition of the city, and how it's reflected in, for example, the umbrella lobby group like the City UK that has a difficult task of trying to bring together all the different views within the city. So if you'd like to email me, I'd love to hear more about that.
Okay. Sort of more of a comment really, but Alan Cook says the HSBC campaign could actually be seen as pro-Brexit as well as a sort of dig towards it, which is interesting.
Yeah, and it definitely could. I mean, the HSBC campaign was about sort of making the most of Brexit, in a way, of sort of stepping out into the world, or as not letting this Brexit moment make us insular. I mean, it was kind of, officially it was agnostic on Brexit. It was just telling us that, we're not an island, we should have a global outlook no matter how we resolve Brexit. And at this point, it was very unclear how we were going to resolve it. So it could be read either way. But the point I think I wanted to make was that it was rare. It's a singular example of a firm really making a high profile step into sort of making a political point, which is already quite rare. We don't see it very often. But that campaign did pay dividends. Whether it was the novelty of it is another question. Whether it's actually repeatable and whether other firms can start making sort of PR campaigns that have similar effects is less clear.
sort of seems we're moving into businesses having a lot more views on sort of global politics as well, and being more open with this. Bob McDowell again has said, do you think the anticipated contraction and globalisation will alter UK politicians' attitudes towards the city?
I think so. So there's a theory within politics and political studies of something called weaponized interdependence, which is the idea that, and we're seeing it play out in Russia at the moment. So it's the idea that if your economy is interdependent, and we're seeing it in, for example, SWIFT in Russia was a key obstacle to get past in terms of the allied forces trying to sort of kneecap the Russian economy and Russian finance. And I think that what we know is that the city is extremely globally networked, but as sort of the global economy is persisting, but global politics are becoming more volatile and dividing into potentially different camps, then there's going to be more and more pressure on the city, but also on the government to actually sort of regulate the city in a way that reflects this. So as I mentioned, there's a sort of cakeism about Rishi Sunak thinking that you can more deeply integrate financial services in the US and in China simultaneously. We saw with the Huawei case that the UK government was going down the Huawei road until sufficient pressure from the US forced it to do a U-turn there. And I can see similar things happening with financial services in the future. More scrutiny being applied to who the city deals with. Yeah, I think this is a key dimension of the delicacy of the current situation.
Right, I think we've got time for one more question. How have movements like Occupy Wall Street or Occupy London affected the relationship between the financial centres and their respective governments?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. As I mentioned, the city doesn't like salient. It likes to move in the shadows, as it were. It likes to do its work quietly. It likes to sort of lobby behind the scenes. Doesn't like to be in the spotlight too much. Now, Occupy Wall Street was a particular moment. Obviously, those camps aren't still about, and as we move further away from a crisis, we have a sort of the history of finance has been one of cyclical booms, busts, crashes, and we're sort of away from that at the moment. But there's a lingering perception that finance, as I said before, finance is finance, and it doesn't deliver enough for the real economy. And I think one thing that Occupy Wall Street did was connect, and Occupy London, you remember at St Paul's Cathedral, was connect broader notions of rampant inequality, the 1%, as it were, to the finance sector. So part of the reputational problem that finance has is it's associated with the 1%. So widening, deepening inequality in advanced industrial economies. But in these economies, everybody, people still have a vote. And this is what really constrains parties as they try to balance sort of in the two sides of democratic capitalism, what capital wants, but also what needs to be done to keep enough people happy, and to keep the sort of social fabric sustainable. And I think that though we don't see Occupy Wall Street anymore, that connection between the city, the sector, and inequality and economic injustice is a problem that sort of lingers for it.
Right, okay, so the recording of the webinar will be available on our website and our YouTube channel, and the slides, a copy of the slides will also be there. Apologies if we didn't get time to answer your question. It will be sent directly to Joe, so he will be in touch with you. So thank you so much again, Joe, for sharing your time and insights with us today. And thank you to our wonderful sponsors for making these webinars possible. And of course, thank you to our lovely audience for your time and contributions. It was a really interesting discussion. And if you'd like to receive the latest updates from the city, you can register to receive our London Financial Centre Bulletin straight to your inbox by following the link that's in the chat box. And do join us again next week for more webinars, or catch up on our YouTube channel. And remember, you can now get your FS Club fix on your favourite podcast app. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Charlotte.
Bye.
Thanks for coming, everybody.